Hey, what's good, high performers and camp believers? Welcome to another episode of the Can't Believe I Made It podcast. I am your host and high performance mentor, Desi Abeda. All right, so today is Monday, so we are hitting you with another Mentorship Monday. And if you are brand new to this podcast, 100% welcome. On Mondays, we try to kick it with like 10 to 15-minute episodes where it's digestible things that you can do to try to create habits that are going to help you to become your healthiest and highest self and bring that version to all of your endeavors that are values to you. And then on Fridays, we usually have some guests on. We might have some life updates. We might break down a TED Talk. There's just a lot that we do on this pod. So if you're new to this pod, and I think we have a couple new ones, welcome to the pod, my friends. All right, so for today's Mentorship Monday episode, I actually got some feedback from one of our pod listeners and pod fams. Cyrus, what's up, bro? I am doing this for you. Cyrus presented something that I thought was really, really good for us to talk about is how we tend to celebrate our progress. And oftentimes what does end up happening, and this is when I first started getting exposed to this very early on as a dietitian, I would find that people would work out or they would go on a run and they would want to reward themselves for doing so. And I think anytime that we try to make progress or anytime that we go out and do something hard, it makes total sense that we want to reward ourselves. In this case, what I was tending to find, and it started to expand into other ideals, and I'm starting to see it a lot more now, even just with a lot of the clients that I'm working with, is that back then they would go on this run or they would work out or they would have a solid week and they would find like, you know what, I want to treat myself. All right. They're part of that that camp of treat yourself, right? Shout out to all you Parks and Rec watchers because I'm a huge fan. But they would treat themselves and they would end up treating themselves in a way where it didn't necessarily erase the amount of work that they did, but it tended to put them behind. So I would see things like, if they were able to get a run in right away, they would be thinking, what sort of food rewards can I have? And what we don't want to do is try to look at our behavior in a way where it's just setting you up to do an action and then get your reward. Okay, because let's go ahead and break this down a little bit more into so it's a little bit more digestible to you. And so what you're going to see here, for those that are going to see the visuals up on our YouTube page or even just on TikTok or other places, what we have here is our habit loop. And so for our listeners out there, as always, I'm going to walk you through it. So anything that we're engaged in, any behavior that we do, any ritual, any habit is going through these three phases. And so to break it down once more, it's going to start with some sort of cue or trigger, right? So I like to think of this area as like your nouns, right? Your person, places, or things. Something happens, you see a person, you're in a certain environment, and it triggers a habitual routine that you tend to engage in a lot. And so that brings us into this next phase. That's the action. This is the behavior following the trigger or right before that given reward. Now, the biggest area that I want us to focus on today is that reward. So, a reward is always going to follow the action, and the action is always going to follow the trigger. And this is how we engage in our habit loop. This is why we do what we do. Now, when we look back at our rewards, I think it's really, really good for us to start being really honest with ourselves. Some of us try to reward ourselves in ways that we know aren't going to be beneficial, right? It's how we celebrate our success. And as we break it down even more, it's really good for you to start understanding yourself in a different way where you know what you need. Right? I just posted this post on TikTok and I was like, hey, as you're going about your day today, why don't you check in with your body? What do you need? Do you need sleep? Do you need a fucking hug? Right? Do you need a friend? Do you need a conversation? Do you need to lift heavy things? Just check in with your body because I think oftentimes when we're constantly in this state of trigger, we're not really checking in with our individual needs. And therefore, we're not really checking in with our individual bodies, our body, our mind, our soul, right? And it's all encompassing in this case. So when I'm asking you to start taking a look at how you reward yourself in those realms of success, I'm also asking you to know yourself enough to say, okay, what are some of the values or some of the things that I'm constantly searching for in the things that I'm involved with? It's very apparent, and this is something that is completely anecdotal, right? It's probably a good homework assignment for me to take a look at some research here, but having worked with a lot of people, towards creating better opportunities for them to step into their creative endeavors, into their businesses, their relationships, their marriages, their, in their parenthood. Asking them to step into that as their highest and healthiest self is a task, because what they're doing is they're starting to unlearn all the things that have gotten them to a point where they really needed someone to help them with the support, the accountability, and the systems of someone like myself. Right. And so going back to this, I really try to implore people that I'm working with, and I'm imploring you as a pod family and pod listeners, to get to know yourself enough where on a day-to-day basis, like some of those value systems. Because going back to things that I'm constantly seeing, a lot of us really crave, from the standpoint of rewards, a lot of us really crave certainty. We really we also crave uncertainty. We also crave like being challenged in our lives. And in the same way, with certainty comes safety, whether that's financial safety, whether that is just mere safety for yourself, safety in your relationships, safety in your job. And a lot of us we want to feel empowered. We want to feel powerful. So those are a lot of the things that I tend to find. And going back into what I really want us to help to try to visualize and work through today is starting to take a magnifying glass and starting to observe how we celebrate our success. Because sometimes when we want to engage in, a celebratory matter, brings in some of those distractions that we've talked about on the pod, right? Substance abuse, alcohol, other risque habits, right? And so, like, these are things that we want to start thinking about from the standpoint of, hey, how do I celebrate my success? And that's not even to say that, like, you have to be engaged in those things to connect with what I'm talking about on this pod or this message, but there are likely things that are going on in your life where you've created rewards for yourself, rewards of, giving yourself a reason to isolate, or giving yourself a reason to not really voice your needs because you might not feel like your needs are even worth being heard. All right, so there's a lot that we look at from the standpoint of awareness here. And what I wanted to do today is to help you to start breaking down some of the ways in which you view success and some of the ways in which you celebrate your progress. Because inevitably, when that thing does happen where you celebrate or you feel like you over celebrate, right? One of the common things that we tend to find is like over celebration is going to come a lot with, alcohol. Let's just say in that case, right? You have a something comes across and you do really well and you really want to celebrate that. So alcohol gets brought in the mix, or other things, food. Those are two things that I tend to find that happen a lot with a lot of clients. It's either food, alcohol is a part of that, or they tend to isolate. They have a really hard time with being able to be present in that success. And so in doing so, what I want to offer you is a couple things for you to start thinking about your success. If it's something that you celebrate with that isn't the healthiest thing for you, is to break it down a little bit. And the first way that we do that is to create awareness. So if you're celebrating in a certain way that isn't beneficial towards the long-term goal, right? And this isn't to say that you can't celebrate. I'm not saying that. Go have your fun 100%. And also, if you're finding that it's starting to become a habitual habit, a routine that doesn't honor some of the big things that you want in your life, this is where I'm talking to you. Okay. And we can insert any celebratory habit in there. I'm just mentioning a few that I help a lot of clients with. Okay. So the first thing we want to do is we want to build some awareness. We want to run it back through the habit loop, just like we talked about with trying to be okay, trying to rebrand how we think about failure. This is the same thing. We want to run it through that same system, but I'm going to give you a little bit more here as it pertains to celebrating in ways that aren't going to be advantageous in the long run. So the first thing we want to do is build that awareness. Where did this come from? What triggered it? What environment was I in? What does my social circle look like now that I'm doing this? And so there's a lot that we want to take a look at here. Is some of this past conditioning, especially as it pertains to food or alcohol or any of the things that we tend to numb ourselves with. It's the same thing here. We want to take a look and say, okay, let me build some awareness. Where is this coming from? And this second step that we want to build some acceptance. Acceptance is hard, because what it's doing is it's you accepting that you're struggling in a certain area. And for those of you who are recovering perfectionists, and because I'm talking to you, most of you are, this is a really hard pill to swallow. And at the same time, this is where we move into disidentification, because what I'm asking you to do is to disidentify with this behavior or habit so that shame is not on board as you're working through this. Because let me tell you something, friends, and this goes back to someone that I've talked about a lot on this pod, Brené Brown. She walks you through the differences between shame and guilt. All right. So guilt, just to kind of rehash it, guilt is I did something bad. I did something that goes against my values. This was out of character for me. I feel guilt about it. Versus shame being, hey, there's something inherently wrong with me. I am something bad. And so when we try to disidentify from the habit or the ritual, this is where we can start to actually do some work. Because if you are identifying, again, identity based habits, if you're identifying with the type of person who does this when they celebrate or who engages in some of these things that aren't going to be beneficial for you in the long run, it makes total sense that that habitual loop is going to continue to happen. But what I'm asking you to do here in disidentifying with it is starting to really observe your behavior, is to be curious about it. We talked about this in Radical Responsibility, right? We had launched a program, I think back in November and December, about radical responsibility. And the whole premise behind it was offering you an opportunity to be curious about your behavior. Because when you can step into more curiosity, you get to release a lot of the shame that's attached to there's something inherently wrong with me. I keep doing this. And then into finding an evolution into, I wonder why I did that. Who was I around? What was going on? What triggered this? You know, how else can I get my needs met? You know, if I'm feeling the need to feel empowered, how do I feel empowered without doing things that aren't beneficial for me in the long run, or that aren't beneficial for me in my work or my marriage, or like whatever that is? And that's how we do this, friends. Like it's a constant daily task of you starting to observe your behavior in a different way and starting to be curious about it. So that's our big thing for today. So going back to what we're working on today, if you are someone who really is having a hard time with your rewards, where you're celebrating success in a way that you probably know isn't very beneficial for you, this is for you. And how we do that is we start to build awareness about that, start to build awareness about, like, okay, where did this come from? We accept that this is something that we're engaging in that is not going to be beneficial for us in the long run. And then we disidentify. We remove the shame by observing. Because here's the thing, the only antidote to shame is going to be empathy. And so, what that looks like is helping you to identify with someone who is able to accept that they're struggling in a certain area and then finding ways to help, right? I'm struggling in this area and that's okay. And my plan is to insert different friend group, insert accountability partner, insert a mentor like myself, insert mental health therapy, like whatever that is, that's going to help you observe your behavior in a different way versus constantly identifying with it. All right. So you already know by now, we're about to hit minute 15. So I'm going to stop at that point. All right. So if something spoke to you, again, the information is readily available. It's the application that most people need when they are stuck. And so in order to do that, all I want you to do is take a screenshot of this episode, tag me at Desi Abeda, tag at I Made It Pod, and make sure that you start to execute some of your vulnerability journey. Okay. We got some really big things rather coming up with episode 100. This is 97. We're going to be doing some giveaways, a couple coaching spots. There's just a lot that I want to celebrate. And I'm so excited to do this with you all heading into episode 100, because you already know the story by now. I overthought this episode or this pod way too much. And this is the culmination of messy action and bravery. And I'm imploring you to do the same in your life. I love you guys. I'll talk to you on the next one. Let's get it.